Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. One of the challenges that I notice along the personal development path is that sometimes the words and the language and the concepts we use become oversimplified, and it becomes a new and creative way to make ourselves wrong and bad, which is extremely troubling. So one of the places that I see this happen, it isn't necessarily in the original text, but sometimes with Law of Attraction with Abraham Hicks material, which is wonderful if you go to the source. I don't think it's one-stop shopping. I think that there's a longing for a guideline or a rule or a system that will make everything feel good all the time. And so a lot of times people try to make something into that. I find that it's a good piece of wisdom. It's a useful thing to understand. If you're studying Law of Attraction, I always recommend also understanding Law of Vibration and Law of Assimilation, because those sit side by side, and you won't have great results with Law of Attraction if you don't work with those other two laws. But I digress. Coming back to these concepts, sometimes I see people being afraid that if they have their full spectrum of emotions, if they have a day where they're grumpy or they're unhappy or something's coming up, that they'll mess up their law of attraction. So not only do they have the legitimate emotion that they're working with, they're legitimately tired or sad or disappointed, and that's moving through. They then have all this tension about feeling the feeling because of a misapplied piece of wisdom. I was watching a YouTube video with some of my favorite creators, and they had missed their flight and got stuck in the airport. And the couple, who's overall super successful and really solid, was having tension because the man was trying to go immediately to let's look on the bright side and, move into more positivity, when they ended up sleeping on the floor of an airport for a night. And in the grand scheme of things, not the end of the world, but the woman of the couple wasn't super happy at a time that she had every expectation of being home with family and loved ones, that after a lot of travel, this was then the outcome that they decided on to manage the situation as it existed. And I noticed myself having this tension that I've had with this particular creator. And it's interesting when we start, looking at other people and seeing where there's trigger. It's always a really good mirror for ourselves. And I totally own this one, where he wasn't letting his wife just move through her feelings, like allowing her on the channel to just be bummed and disappointed and grumpy about being exhausted and not getting to sleep in a bed that night for a whole variety of reasons. And I certainly can resemble that, where I really wish I wasn't feeling something that I was feeling. I've gotten better about calling it out and acknowledging it so I can kind of diffuse the energy. I think that can be really helpful. So I might say to somebody, wow, I really wanted to show up for our time in this really playful, fun, energized, I'm delighted to be with you aspect. And actually what's alive for me is more quiet and still and a little bit moody. I'm not angry or grumpy. I'm not going to take it out on you, but are you still down to spend time? It's not what I hoped to co-create with you, but this is what's showing up. So there's an importance to not trying to use our spiritual practices to bypass feeling emotion as it arises. However, those tools are really good for making sure we don't get stuck in emotion, because it's very problematic if we end up feeling the same thing over and over and over again for long periods of time. So being angry constantly, very problematic, hard on the physical health, hard on the mental and emotional health, blocks a lot of diversity of expression, generally tough for relationships. So the tools that are designed to move us out aren't designed to mask an authentic, immediate anger response. They're really good, though, for cleaning up emotional debt, the anger that we have that is disproportional to the current situation, and they're good for reducing reactivity. So that's the thing where your bandwidth is just limited. So something that's a small bump or disruption becomes much larger. So that can be good for these tools. Or if you've gotten stuck there, if you're cycling on something, these tools are really good. But a lot of times these pieces of wisdom get misapplied, and it can become something to make yourself bad and wrong about that is never the intent or the truth of the wisdom. And this kind of harm, unfortunately, gets perpetuated in our interactions with others, because just like at a moment when I wasn't so much enjoying what I was feeling, I was annoyed with this man on YouTube for trying to tell his wife she wasn't allowed to have her feelings when I understood why she felt the way she did. I was right in the middle of that self-argument. A lot of times we end up going online. So you see someone express pain and you get all this advice and silver lining, and at least it's this. And sometimes that can be helpful, judiciously. There can be ways that that's appropriate to the relationship. But a lot of times empathy and acknowledging and hearing someone and saying that you care about them and being willing to just be present with them while it's painful is really potent and appropriate and relationship building. Sometimes when you can't solve an issue in a relationship, a beautiful place to go with it is, let's be sad together. I have a client who has a man that she loves dearly but can't live with. It just doesn't work. And we were talking, and the wisdom that I was called to share with her was, rather than telling him yet again what he was doing that didn't work for her — she's been trying to be heard about that for years — instead saying, I love you and I'm really sad we don't get to live together, that doesn't work for who we are, so let's be sad together. And it's just a way of really shifting things that are important so both people can be heard, even when there isn't a solution that makes everyone happy. Sometimes it's really sad when you have to say, yeah, we're just not going to go forward because we can't get to a win-win. A win-win is not available. We've used our resourcefulness, we've used our tools, so we could be sad together that we don't get to share this thing or do this thing or embark on this project or whatever it might be. And that's a powerful place to sit with that. So along the lines of this, I want to talk about sort of the general concept of self-esteem. And when those words come into the equation, it often is coming from women, sometimes men, but women are more likely to use that language. And it's kind of yet another way that they've evaluated themselves of falling short. Like, I have low self-esteem. There's this self-esteem thing I'm supposed to have, and it isn't as big as it should be. And that's another failing, along with whatever stories they might have about, other ways that they're not enough. So there's this sort of standard issue thing that we all seem to have that we absorb from having a somewhat disjointed culture. I believe this is something that comes out of a modern era that isn't these small tribes where everyone pretty much agrees on how things are supposed to go. So if you have really strong agreements about structure, it's easier to get a more coherent picture of whether you're right or wrong in regards to the tribe. Now, I'm a huge fan of the enormous freedom and choice and movement. I've always been happier when I've had more diversity of people to explore with, more options about what I do, less of a rigid structure that I have to conform to. So I love this, but at the same time, we still all have these instincts that are trying to figure out what will make us good enough to the tribe so that we don't get kicked out because that's a death sentence. So we have sort of these instincts trying to read something that are being spoken to by marketing messages and arguments on Facebook and people being angry about different things. We're taking in information from very disjointed sources, and it can form this sort of bizarre picture of who we're supposed to be that is rather unrealistic and unattainable and not necessarily embodied by anyone. And we have so many examples to, choose from that are beyond the scope of a small tribe of humans. So the best at whatever is a standard that's held up out of millions of people who didn't rise to the amazing levels of singing or dancing or performance or Olympic sports or success as a CEO in a business. We're comparing ourselves with these really false comparisons. And there's been a lot of psychological study, particularly around social media, about the highlights reel and the false comparison, and frankly, how this messes with the neurology of our brain. I'm super geeky about neuroscience because I really want to understand how I work and then how to move with that so that I'm not fighting against my biology. The more I can naturally create a situation where my biology is chill, the less time I spend managing anxiety or emotional roller coasters or things like that. If you want to geek out on this, one of the things I really liked was a course called The Science of Well-Being, which is by a Yale professor who really talks about the science of what makes humans happy and how bad we are at predicting it. Like, most people want things and think they'll make them happy, and statistics show us that there's not as much correlation with happiness as we seem to all believe in our secret heart of hearts about these various things. And it's very illuminating because if you can find that belief and see that it's disproven, it gives you a lot of ability to know where to question your thinking, and will put you on a much better track toward what will actually make you happy, which I think is an awesome skill set for any of us to have. How do I tend and feed my own happiness in a way that doesn't necessarily involve dramatic shifts of circumstances? Of course, if you're in some acute circumstance like domestic violence or lack of safety, shifting your circumstances should totally be a top priority. That is an excellent thing to focus on. But assuming everything's all kind of equal and, reasonably okay, not perfect, but, there's no active abuse or harm or danger, there's a lot of happiness as an inside job, and understanding that is really useful. So coming back around to the self-esteem concept, it seems to be not a thing that's empowering, but a thing where we feel like we're falling short, because I believe it's an oversimplification of a very complicated concept. So for me, and for most of the people that I've talked to, especially women, I find that self-esteem is something that has a rise and fall. There's a way that it moves with my hormonal cycle. If my hormonal cycle's in a certain place, my sense of self is going to be more robust and elated. I'll feel less vulnerable to criticism. If I'm tired, my sense of self is a little bit weaker. And I like the idea of starting to think about replacing self-esteem with sense of self. So some people have a really strong sense of self. They're like, yeah, I know who I am, and I'm in grace with that, and there's clarity around this. And I'm talking about a sense of self that is accurate. A lot of people build up a sense of self that is a lot of virtue signaling and who they should be. They've taken on concepts from the culture and they're trying to be the thing that they believe will get them love and approval. So I've done a lot of Byron Katie work to sort of soften those concepts of always being one way or never being another way, and just seeing there being more commonality and more choice for how to move with it. So if you have a rather unknowable and impossible to put into words, but a sense of who you are that isn't a mental construct or a structure or something that you've taken on because someone told you that good people should be this way and bad people should be that way. There are these things that are tied to, do no harm. That's a really good one. Like, don't make anybody else's journey harder through your messiness, if at all possible. Don't, harm others to your advantage to try to get something. So, stealing, generally not a super optimal kind of behavior. But beyond that, there's a lot of ways that we can take on ideas that are really more neutral. So for example, I tend to be a bit of a rule follower and kind of had that good girl strategy. So I was always behaving in class and getting the approval of the teachers. And if the sign said, don't walk on the grass, I was going to not walk on the grass and then look around to make sure that everybody else wasn't walking on the grass either. And I was very upset when authority figures expressed rules that they didn't enforce, because my little lawyer mind was like, you have to behave. It's really important. And I recognize that as a safety survival strategy for a very sensitive little girl who was very reactive to having people upset with her. So being in trouble with disapproval, I was sensitive to energy and emotionally sensitive, and it was a big deal. So I came up with a strategy to avoid that. But it was really fun and empowering to be up in the mountains and have a gate that was closed and say, the road's clear. I'm going to go drive around that, because they left space for it. If they really didn't want us to go, they had a better gate they could close. And, I'll do this at my own risk. I'll stop if I run into snow, which I did, and turned around, went back, had the vehicle for it, had someone with me, had a device to call someone. Knew that, was kind of on my own. I met a guy who did spend the night stuck in the snow because he went down in a passenger car. But there was something powerful about being able to see a rule and make a empowered decision for myself about whether I wanted to follow it or not. And I like to give myself that option and freedom, and there's a maturity around that when it was a knee-jerk survival strategy wasn't necessarily available. And for some people, there's a weaker sense of self. And weaker sense of self, I would say, ironically, some of the people who are like going to tell you all about who they are. I do a lot of online dating, which is really interesting because you're reading people's stories about who they are. And they reveal a lot in the language that they use. So whenever I see a profile where a man is describing himself as an alpha male, I'm all about steering really clear of that, because he's, has this identity. There's code words in there for what he's trying to signal, and a lot of them are probably not going to be something that I'm going to enjoy if he's presenting that version of himself. So I would say that some people can seem like they have a strong sense of self, but they're very much based in the narrative of who they are. And one of the pieces of discernment that I find most useful is looking at how close someone's story of who they are and who I experience them to be line up. And for some people, there's a huge gap between who they say they are and who I experience them to be. And for some people that, we all have blind spots. Nobody's going to be one for one, and I'm looking with my own filters. But I have a lot more success if I experience that congruence between someone's story. So I wouldn't describe somebody who has a incredibly invested in story about themselves as having good self-esteem, even though they believe a story about who they are. But then there are also people who have a really weak sense of self-esteem, so they can feel like they're bad and wrong if anyone is upset in the environment. And that reaction tends to go a lot more with instincts being really activated. So if your fight or flight is activated, one of the responses that's a survival mechanism is to try to please and avoid being displeasing. And that's a good survival strategy to not get kicked out of the tribe, which would have been a death sentence. So if you get along with the tribe, they'll share their food, they'll help protect you, and you'll survive, your children will survive. This is a really important kind of thing. And what I would offer is, even though most of us are living unprecedentedly safe lives with levels of safety our ancestors never could have conceived of, our instincts are very activated by a lot of stimulation that our brains weren't designed to interpret. And so there's just some adult supervision to provide for our instincts, because self-actualization and speaking your truth and negotiating for something that meets really important human needs, but that aren't survival needs. So when we're not talking about food and shelter and not being physically hit and things like that, we can go into contribution and love and connection and being seen and being understood. These are all really important needs, but we're designed to work with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so our fight or flight, the adrenaline and cortisol chemistry can trick us into believing that we need to resolve a survival need by pleasing and not being displeasing before we get a sense of who we are in the world and how we want to stand in that. And it makes sense, because if somebody's going to chop your head off for, arguing with them, if they have a really bad temper and they're really violent and you can't run away fast enough or beat them up in a fight, then you probably do want to swallow your self-expression, and at least we got that biology a lot, because the people who did stand their ground, regardless of the violence that was meted out to them, often died before they could reproduce or weren't around to keep their children alive. So those didn't become our many, many times great-grandmothers and grandfathers. It might be the soul expression that you had in a past life that's incarnate in this life, and that's a whole different ball of wax. But in general, that's not what our biology is saying. And so one of the things, if you're feeling like, wow, I'm not talking very nice to myself, I'm not treating myself with unconditional friendliness. I like to substitute words when there's a whole lot of energy around something that I feel like brings in a lot of energies that aren't what I'm going for. So instead of looking to gratitude, which can be, again, taken in a shaming way, wow, you have such a good quality of life, how can you not be filled with gratitude? Well, survival needs are one level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It definitely is unhappy not to have that. I want everybody to have that, but it's far from the whole picture. We're complicated, multi-layered creatures. And so with gratitude, because of the way that it can be used to shame or not doing it well enough or not having enough or not doing often enough, I like to lean into wonder, because wonder for me is very similar. It's a very similar vibration, but I'm looking at the beauty of the world. I'm being awed by a sunset or a leaf or the beauty of a tree or the taste of chocolate. The leaning in and actively cultivating the response of wonder is really good medicine for me. And likewise, rather than self-esteem as a measure of how it's going in your internal landscape, I like the concept of unconditional friendliness. I get this phrase from Pema Chodron, who is a marvelous Tonglen teacher, among other things. I adore her wisdom. I won't try to duplicate it here, but that's one of the things she talks about. She calls it Maitri. I believe that's a Sanskrit word. But this unconditional friendliness, I think, is a good way to just take a measure of whether you're playing nice with yourself. So you may be able to think of a couple that are both like really good people, like really esteemable. There's good for other people that they're in the world. They're kind to rescue dogs, whatever it is, who in their interpersonal dynamic just tear each other to shreds because they're unskillful at relating. And I find it really heartbreaking when you have two good people who love each other a lot, who, because of lack of skill in relating, have strategies, probably that they learned in their family of origin, that get into power struggles and arguing their point by putting the other person down. I learned a lot of these strategies. I tended to argue people into silence because I was so articulate and so intelligent and so persistent, and they would stop arguing with me because they couldn't win. I was better at it, and it never brought me closer. Like, proving that I was right and they were wrong definitively did not make them want to meet more of my needs, did not make them want to spend time with me, did not make them want to heart connect with me. So I spent a lot of time kind of sitting my butt down in therapy and learning not to do that because of the damage it was doing to my relationships. And similarly, when it comes to internal relating, I would like to offer that it's complicated. So one of the things, this might be TMI about my personal life, but I've had times when I've had relationships that were monogamous, but probably more time in more of a polyamorous or ethical non-monogamy context. And the joy of that for me personally, as someone who just seems to be really in primary relationship with myself. At least that's true at this moment when I'm recording this podcast. If you went back to Katie in her 30s, I was very, very moved by this idea of partnership, which I tried to make with work out with some very unsuitable candidates, and that went about as well as it usually does because I was so in love with partnership. But one of the beauties of being in the online dating world is there's an openness. Like, I don't have to take up everything that someone has. I don't have to decide if their desire for children is something I could work with, because I'm like, well, I'm not going to have children. I'm past that, generally that phase of my life that's not in the cards. If you have children, cool, we'll work that out. But, there's not a need for nearly so much alignment because I'm not trying to go as deep with these people. I can mix and match. So if somebody is available for this part of time or this thing, I can look to someone else to be available for something they're not available for, and I can enjoy them and appreciate them. But there isn't the depth and the intimacy. You need so many more points of alignment if you're sharing and balancing needs about really important things. So because my finances are completely sovereign, I don't have to work out money things with anyone else other than them being solvent enough that they're not asking me for a loan. So I won't date anybody who is, in a financial disaster. I question whether you should be spending your energy on online dating if you are struggling to not be homeless and find work or, work out some of these kind of things. But regardless, for me, I don't want to date that person. But beyond that, I don't have to worry about how they manage money. I don't have to worry about whether they keep their job because, I'm not dependent on them for my financial well-being. So the closer someone is, the more you're going to care about how they do them. And there's a lot of discernment in choosing someone who naturally wants to do them in a way that works well enough for you. And this is about not trying to make relationship happen across deal breakers, that you can have success with them and let them be them. And there's a lot of wrangling of yourself, at least in my case, not to try to control someone or get in their business, to let them do them and do me, and then find the win-wins. And these are really sophisticated relationship skills. I don't know anyone who has a depth of relating that is really successful, like partnership where they're really deeply in love, have great affinity, have a lot of appreciation, have a lot of success, who isn't going to say in response to being asked about their relationship, well, it takes a lot of hard work. It takes a lot of, skill essentially. And happily, relating is a learnable skill. I've done a lot to learn about relating, and my richness of my social circle and the success of my relationships in my 40s is astronomically better than it was in my 20s. So the nice thing is you don't just get born with it. It really is a learnable skill. And similarly, what I would offer when we start to look internally is that relating to ourselves is a learnable skill. And at the core of so much of what I do, I'm wanting to help people be good at relating to themselves. Understand that they're not having parts that are trying to hurt them or sabotage them. Another one of those words that I like to replace is this concept of self-sabotage. I like to think of it as inelegant strategies. So there's some part of you that's a no to a path that you're embarking on, maybe for a really legitimate reason. There might be something that, you want so much for the job to work out that's incredible money and sounds really challenging that you ignored all the indications that in your heart of hearts, your new manager might well be bipolar, and that's going to cause some problems. So sometimes we fight with ourselves because we're not listening to intuition and other knowing, and we're so hungry for something we proceed forward, and then it's usually unsustainable. And sometimes it's just fear. Sometimes it's just too much change too fast, or we haven't calmed the fight or flight enough to allow ourselves to feel safe enough to innovate or take something else on. And what I would offer is that this concept of self-esteem, where there's this thing that you could get to that's a marker of how healthy you are or are not, is really misleading, because again, I feel like the grace with which we're dealing with ourselves is gonna vary a lot on any given day. So a couple that is generally successful and happy going through a joyful experience, they're hanging with friends, they're likely to be really successful and happy. But if someone's in the hospital, or a child is ill, or, a parent is needing care and everybody's really busy, there's going to probably be more tension in a relationship that is still equally successful. It's just that there's more tension. So if you're under more stress, your ability to relate to yourself successfully becomes more complicated. And I'm a huge fan of doing inner work proactively and not just as crisis management. A lot of people go to inner work as an absolute last resort because they notice that, drinking more wine or smoking more pot or, buying a bunch of things on Amazon is not super sustainable, or, they do what I did in my 20s, where I realized all these engineering teams that I'd worked with couldn't get away from me fast enough once the team project was over. And I realized that my social skills could use a little work. I was steamrolling the team, and it turned out they didn't like it, even if we got an A at the end of the project. So a lot of times it's like a movement of last resort. But I would love to offer that when there's nothing terrible going on, this proactive process of saying, all right, how do I balance my masculine and my feminine? You may want to use different language if you don't like those terms, but for me, there's the yin and the yang, the doing, the, accomplishing. And when I have the energy in my belly to be in productivity, I love that feeling. So it means that sometimes I fight when I need to rest and have downtime and have substance and stillness and do something joyful, like go sit outside and play with the neighbor's dogs who come to my sliding glass door, which I really love. It's really fulfilling to sit under my pepper tree and gaze at the hills and love on the dogs. And yet I don't always make time for that. So if I'm not making time for that, my masculine and feminine may have come out of balance. There are ways that our chakras can go to war with each other. I've talked about in other episodes the aligned yes of having consensus among your chakras before you embark on a path. It doesn't mean they all love the new possibility, the trip, the new job, the new relationship, but it means that none of them are a hell no, because you won't really have sustainability if you try to embark on a path that some part of you is a hell no to. Again, not like it's its favorite path, like you could still have anxiety about, taking on a new job, but if it's debilitating anxiety, you're liable to get sick or, get in a car accident, not in a, put a terrible possibility, but, I had a student that I worked with and client, and she really had some parts of her that were at war with a graduate program that she was going into, and she ended up getting sick and coming home in this international program that part of her was really magnetized toward and really excited about. So it's just more elegant if you work things out internally and kind of get all of yourself on the same page. I sometimes talk about this like a CEO of a company doing a good job facilitating collaboration between all the different departments who are all interested in different aspects of the company. So the engineers need to build something that marketing can sell, and they need to do it within a time frame that the financial department says we have the resources to pay the engineers to be in research and development mode where we're not making money. And if it's not something that all those departments can agree on, then it's probably not a good idea to go forward with that particular project. They should probably go back to the drawing board and find something that the engineers can actually build, that marketing can actually sell, that they can afford to have built, that human resources says, we're still treating people in a way that's okay internally and externally. All these parts need to agree, and that's a really good model for ourselves. And so when we're starting to look at this self-esteem, I would invite you to try to put that aside and just try on the possibility of using unconditional friendliness for what we call a litmus test, which is just telling you, how am I doing? How is the weather inside of me? If I'm being really angry and harsh and self-critical, I'm probably in an adversarial relationship with myself in some way. that's going to be exhausting and expensive and not very effective. And if you're not doing anything, like times when I've been stuck in a procrastination cycle, what sucked was my head was so loud that I didn't even get to enjoy the thing that I was doing instead of what I was supposed to be doing. So there's a lot of merit to noticing, to having a process where you notice when your self-talk becomes very critical, and then sort of being the detective, like, why am I beating up on myself about this? What's going on? Oh, my instincts are really active and I'm feeling unsafe, so I'm trying to be perfect so people will love me. If that's the conclusion, Brene Brown is your friend. She has magnificent material. But also, the invitation is to recognize that self-esteem is probably not a fixed thing. And because of the closeness of the relationship, you literally have to work out and come to agreement in some way or other with every aspect of yourself for everything that matters to you about your life. So you're balancing the need for safety and money with self-actualization, with what your soul wants to experience, with where your heart is magnetized, with what is and isn't okay with you, with what you feel called to express, with how you want to be seen and known, with what speaks to you, with what you want to do with your time and talent. There's so much that's being balanced in complicated ways, and there's a stressfulness if it's not managed to the array of possibilities that we have. And I love having all the possibilities. I love how much I can understand the modern system and work within it to write my own ticket in a way that I feel like, by my definition, has a lot of joy in it and happiness and fulfillment for me, and has a lot of good in it for other people. It's really important to me that my movement through the world has good in it for others, or is at least neutral. There are lots of people that I'm like, I don't have anything to offer you. I don't think I can help. Let's just go our separate ways. So I'm definitely not feeling like there has to be good in it for everyone in the world, but I do want where I can contribute. I look for those leverage points where what I have to offer blooms into something that has tremendous benefit for other people. Those ways of sharing my energy are incredibly compelling. If I can channel the little piece of information or say the thing that really sparks something that unfolds, because that's what I've really valued in the people in my life who have given me these maps that have stayed really tried and true over the years. But when it comes to relating to yourself, if you accept that all the different needs that you have, all the different factors that you're balancing are incredibly complicated, that for many things we're not 100% one way or another. The choice to have children, some people are completely clear that they don't want them or completely clear that they do, but a lot of the population, could be 60-40, could be 30-70. And there's a part of them that wants one thing and a part of them that wants the other thing, and they're going to choose to go one direction. Either they'll have children or they won't have children. So then there's complexity around the part of them that was a no to what they end up choosing at the level of fact. And how do they make sure their life has enough in it for the part of them that longed for something else, in order to not have a critical need get so hungry that there's a big pendulum swing. Because if we really, really want something and we completely ignore it for too long, that's where we sometimes make these pendulum swings where, you might conserve money, and then binge spend, for example. Or you might work a job you hated, and then quit out of the blue with no plan, and then, sit home and take no action, be really, really stuck on moving the other direction. And what I find is, if we stay out of these really big pendulum swings, another happens in relationship. We tolerate and don't speak up for something that isn't okay with us until we're so aggravated about it that we don't care if we lose the relationship, as long as we never have to deal with that again. The guy that I was involved with in my 20s, we had a 7-year relationship and a lot of dysfunction, really lovely person, but neither of us were all that healthy. And I kept thinking, if I could find the perfect words to explain to him how his addictive tendencies tendencies affected me, he would stop doing it. And so I stopped speaking to him when we left, not because I was angry or I thought he was bad or he'd done me wrong, but it was just such a relief never to have to try to be heard by him again. And there might have been a more graceful way of over communicating and then, cutting off. Not that it's a problem with that relationship, but that's not really a viable solution with yourself. So I think how you're talking to yourself, in whether you're able to have unconditional friendliness, you can choose unconditional friendliness, you can implement unconditional friendliness when you notice. So celebrate if you notice you're saying mean things to yourself, because it gives you a chance to redirect rather than just running self-criticism in the background. And then you can consciously, deliberately say, regardless of how I feel about my performance in the world as a human being, I'm going to be unconditionally friendly. It's not conditional on what I do or don't do or how I feel about it. It doesn't mean that you're not doing your best to choose a path that is within the letter of the law and doesn't harm other people and doesn't harm yourself and has sustainability for your health and, all of these good things. But if you've decided that sugar isn't good for you and you binge eat chocolate cake, I'd like you to still be unconditionally friendly with yourself so that then you can get curious about what series of events led to a moment that was out of balance for you. Not that I'm against binge eating chocolate cake occasionally, but for some people, if there are underlying health conditions like diabetes, that can be a lot more serious, especially if it's happening frequently. So that would be a good place to, go into your curiosity. But the invitation would be to say that just as we expect that really successful, intimate marriages and relationships have ups and downs and require a lot of work, the most intimate relationship you will ever be in is with yourself. You're with yourself all the time. And the complexity of that means that, unfortunately, in my experience, if you're really being awake and alive to yourself, there isn't some off-the-shelf wisdom that applies for everything. There's a complicated, learnable skill about how to do you in the world where you can tend to sustain this unconditional friendliness toward yourself as a default. It's what shows up rather than what you're making happen. You can make it happen, and that's very worthwhile. But there's also a place where what kind of circumstances and environment and skill set for doing you do you need in order for that to show up organically? And I feel like those are better questions to ask because, again, I work with a lot of people, and sometimes I get people who have self-diagnosed as having low self-esteem, like it's a personal failing or it's a psychological failure. And I think that there can be a lot of emphasis on trauma as opposed to the learnable skill of relating well to yourself. I know this is already really long, but one of the things that was a huge relief to me was when I started to get into my metaphysical path and to be able to access, you could call it my past lives or the Akashic records, and realize that while, there were moments that my parents weren't as elegant as they could have been, a lot of the emotional and psychological struggle that I had nothing to do with anything that they did or didn't do as parents. They might have triggered something, but there was past life wounding that needed to be worked through and cleared, and it wasn't caused by my parents. And there was lack of skill because of my energetic sensitivity. My social skills developed slowly because being with other people was so overwhelmingly loud. Imagine if you were trying to learn social cues while somebody was, yelling through a megaphone right next to you. You'd probably be bad at that. You'd probably be bad at anything you tried to learn with the megaphone yelling at you thing happening. And that was how the energetic sensitivity was. I was dissociative because I was overwhelmed. So my loneliness and my disconnection and my lack of success with other people was really just about a learnable skill that, because of a specific circumstance, I didn't have the chance to learn until later in life. So I just want to offer this not as an ongoing path of needing more and more healing, because I think that we can be healed much earlier than we often think we are, but as an ongoing refining the relationship with yourself so it becomes increasingly elegant, and expecting that it's going to be nuanced and complicated, and the manual of the care and feeding of yourself. Like I think of the care and feeding of the Katie. There are all these distinctions that I have that are the wisdom that really sets me up to thrive. And it's not that I don't cultivate resilience so that I can deal with situations where I just can't have the thing that would really work for me. The thing that would work for me is getting enough sleep, and sometimes that's just not in the cards. I'm not always a good sleeper. So I cultivate the ability to work with that as gracefully as possible, but I also really work to understand myself so that there's more ease in enjoying being me. And I think that that's the ultimate outcome of having this right relationship that's internal, this ease, this getting along with myself. When parts of me are squabbling over the one output, which will be my actions, what do I do with myself next? That I have some ways to, like a skillful parent, facilitate the argument that's going on and get everybody playing nice with each other. So I know this has moved around a lot of territory and a lot of life learning, but these are some of the things that I'm most passionate about in my life. And so I hope that there's something in here that will really support you in your journey. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.